I haven't breathed real air in 7 years. Not once. Not a single breath. The rebreather unit surgically grafted to my throat processes recycled oxygen, filters out the carbon dioxide, and feeds my lungs through tubes that bypass my mouth entirely. I can't remember what breathing feels like. The expansion of chest, the coolness of air through nostrils, the simple autonomy of drawing breath by choice. My lungs inflate and deflate on schedule, mechanical and precise, controlled by augmetic regulators that don't care about my preferences. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is standing on the hull of the Merchant's Reprieve, magnetic boots locked to corroded metal, scraping warp barnacles off Geller field emitters, while reality itself presses against the shimmering purple barrier, just inches from my visor. The worst part is seeing faces form in that barrier, human faces, demonic faces, faces that shouldn't exist, and knowing that if the field flickers for even a millisecond, those things on the other side will have me, will consume me, will do things to my soul that make death look like mercy. My name was Davos Crane. I was 22 years old when I signed the contract. I'm 29 now, though time doesn't work the same when you spend months at a stretch in the warp, and I've learned that numbers lie when applied to horror. 7 years. Could be 7 decades subjectively. Could be 7 minutes subjectively. The warp doesn't care about chronology. It just cares about feeding. But let me tell you how I got here. How I went from a desperate young man on a failing hive world to this. Standing on the skin of a ship traveling through literal hell, scraping off the things that grow there, breathing through tubes, and praying to gods that don't exist that the field holds for just one more shift. Hive Volantis. That's where I was born. 3rd tier, Manufactorum district, in a hab block that housed 12,000 workers and their families in spaces designed for 8,000. My father worked the smelting furnaces, 14-hour shifts 6 days a week, breathing toxic fumes that turned his lungs black and fibrous. He died when I was 19, collapsed in the middle of a shift, lungs finally giving out after 27 years of service. The Manufactorum gave us his final wages minus the cost of disposing his body. 300 throne geld. That's what they valued a man's life at. I took his place at the furnaces. What else was I going to do? The Imperium doesn't waste resources on education for 3rd-tier hive workers. You're born into a role, you fulfill that role, you die in that role, and your children take your place. That was the system. That was the propaganda the priests called the Emperor's Divine Order. Everyone in their proper place, serving according to their station, protected by his eternal wisdom. But my father's death taught me what that protection was worth. Nothing. The Emperor didn't protect him. The system just consumed him and moved on to the next component. I lasted 6 months at the furnaces before I knew I couldn't survive it. The heat was unbearable. 50 degrees Celsius on average, spiking to 70 during peak production. The fumes burned my throat and lungs even through the cheap rebreather masks they issued. I could feel my body breaking down, cells dying, organs failing. I was becoming my father, walking the same path to the same early grave. So when the recruitment ship arrived, I listened. The Merchant's Reprieve was a Conquest-class merchant hauler, 3 kilometers long, registered to Rogue Trader House Malvar. They were hiring what they called hull maintenance specialists. A euphemism I didn't understand at the time, but learned to hate with perfect clarity later. The wages were extraordinary. 20,000 throne geld per year, plus room and board, plus medical care, plus a completion bonus after a 5-year contract. In 1 year, I could earn what my father had made in 6 years of smelting furnaces. In 5 years, I could accumulate enough wealth to buy my way out of the hive entirely, maybe even passage off-world to somewhere less toxic. The recruitment officer was efficient. He didn't waste time on pleasantries or explanations. Just showed us the contract, explained the compensation, and asked who was desperate enough to sign. 47 men stepped forward. I was one of them. "The work is dangerous," the officer said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "Hull maintenance requires spacewalks during warp transit. You will be trained, you will be equipped, you will be compensated. Attrition rate is approximately 37% over 5 years. Those who complete their contracts will be wealthy. Those who don't will be dead. The Emperor protects the diligent." 37%. I heard that number and thought I could be one of the 63% who survived. I was young, strong, careful. I could do dangerous work if it meant escaping the furnaces. I could endure 5 years of risk if it meant a future. So I signed, pressed my thumb to the data slate, watched my name appear in Imperial Gothic script on the contract template, and committed myself to 5 years of service aboard the Merchant's Reprieve. They didn't tell us what the work actually involved. That came later. That came when we were already trapped, already committed, already owned. They processed us in batches of 10, stripped us, decontaminated us, catalogued us like cargo. My designation became HR 447. Hull scraper, personnel number 447. Not a name, not a person, just a functional component with a tracking number. The augmentation came first. They didn't ask permission. The contract included a clause about necessary medical modifications for role performance. I only understood what that meant when they strapped me into a surgical cradle and a medical servitor approached with a rebreather grafting unit. "Procedure will be performed without anesthetic," the servitor said, its voice flat and mechanical. "Pain responses are necessary for optimal tissue integration. Screaming is expected and will be ignored." They cut my throat open from collarbone to jaw. I felt every incision, felt them installing the rebreather unit into my trachea, felt them threading tubes into my lungs, felt them sealing the wound with bioadhesive and surgical staples. The pain was transcendent, beyond description, beyond endurance. I screamed until my vocal cords tore, and they didn't stop. They just kept working, mechanically precise, installing the augmentation whether I consented or not. When they finished, I couldn't speak. My vocal cords were damaged, and the rebreather unit bypassed my mouth entirely. I could make sounds, gasps, wheezes, wet gurgling noises, but not words, not speech. They'd taken my voice along with my autonomy over breathing. "Vocal function is unnecessary for role performance," the medical servitor explained. "Respiratory efficiency has been optimized. You may experience psychological discomfort during adaptation phase. This is normal and will be ignored." They did the same to all 47 of us. Turned us into voiceless workers who breathed by machine instead of choice. And that was just the first augmentation. Next came the magnetic boot implants. Anchors surgically embedded in our feet and lower legs that interfaced with specialized boots, allowing us to lock ourselves to the hull during spacewalks. The procedure involved drilling into bone, installing metal anchors, and connecting them to neural interfaces so we could activate the magnets by thought alone. More pain. More screaming. More being told our suffering was necessary for optimal performance. Then the suit integration ports, data jacks installed at the base of our skulls, along our spines, at major joints. These allowed our void suits to interface directly with our nervous systems, providing direct sensory feedback about pressure, temperature, and structural integrity. The installation process involved cutting through skin and muscle to expose nerve bundles, then connecting synthetic neural sheaths that would relay suit data to our brains. By the time they finished the augmentation process, we barely looked human anymore. Our throats were masses of scar tissue and metal. Our legs were reinforced with internal bracing. Our bodies were studded with data ports. We'd been modified into specialized tools, optimized for a function we still didn't understand. Then they showed us the Geller field. The Geller field is the only thing that allows humans to travel through the warp. Without it, the moment a ship transitions from real space into the immaterium, everything aboard is consumed by the entities that dwell there. The barrier between real and unreal dissolves, and the things that exist in that nightmare dimension pour in, eager to feed on physical matter and human souls. The field creates a bubble of reality around the ship, maintaining the fiction that normal physics applies, that matter and energy behave predictably, that cause and effect still function. But it's just a fiction, a desperately maintained illusion, and it requires constant maintenance. That's where we came in. During warp transit, the Geller field emitters accumulate what we call warp barnacles, the training officer explained. He was a grizzled man named Harrow, 50 years old, with cybernetic eyes and a voice like grinding metal. They're not actually barnacles. They're accretions, crystallized reality distortions, failed materialization attempts. The things in the warp press against the field constantly, trying to find weaknesses, trying to break through. Sometimes they almost succeed, and when they fail, they leave residue on the emitters. That residue interferes with field generation. If it accumulates too much, the emitters fail. If the emitters fail, the field collapses. If the field collapses, everyone dies. He showed us picked captures of what warp barnacles look like. Organic growths that shouldn't exist, crystalline structures that bent light wrong, that seemed to have too many dimensions, that hurt to look at directly. They grew on the Geller field emitters like tumors, spreading across the hull wherever the field was weakest. Your job is to scrape them off, Harrow continued. During warp transit, you'll go outside in void suits and manually remove the accretions from the emitters. The work must be done while we're in the warp, because that's when they grow. You'll work in teams of 2 4-hour shifts, cycling through all 47 of you around the clock. The field will be active. You'll be working inches away from it. Do not touch it. Do not let your tools touch it. Do not break the barrier. If you do, you'll be pulled through to the other side, and we will not retrieve you. One of the other recruits, a young man named Petron, raised his hand. He'd retained his voice because his augmentation had gone slightly better than mine. "What's on the other side?" he asked. Harrow looked at him for a long moment. "Nothing you want to meet. Nothing human. Nothing sane. The warp is inhabited by entities that exist in ways that violate every law of physics. They're hungry, they're malevolent, and they're very, very interested in us. When you're out there scraping barnacles, you'll be separated from them by maybe half a meter of Geller field. You'll see them pressing against it. You'll see faces forming in the barrier. Human faces, usually, because they've learned that's what disturbs us most. They'll mouth words at you. They'll gesture. They'll try to communicate. Ignore them. They're not trying to talk. They're trying to find psychological vulnerabilities, weaknesses they can exploit. If they break your mind, they can use you to break the field. The Emperor protects the faithful," someone said reflexively. Toman, another recruit, repeating the catechism we'd all been taught since childhood. Harrow laughed. It was a bitter, ugly sound. "The Emperor is a corpse on a throne 10,000 light-years away. He doesn't even know you exist. The field protects you. The field and your diligence and luck. The Imperium's propaganda promises divine protection, but I've been doing this work for 30 years, and I've watched 200 men die. Not one of them was saved by prayer. Keep the field working, and you live. Let it fail, and you're food for things that will torture your soul for eternity. That's the only protection you're going to get. That should have been when we ran, when we demanded to void our contracts, when we refused this nightmare work. But we were already trapped. The contracts were binding, the augmentations were irreversible, and the ship was already preparing for warp transit. We had no choice but to do the work we'd signed up for, even though they'd deliberately withheld what that work actually meant until we were committed. The Imperium's method: trap people with false promises, modify them past the point of return, then reveal the horror they've already agreed to endure. Perfect efficiency. Perfect cruelty. 3 days later, we made our first warp jump. And I learned what it meant to scrape barnacles off the Geller field while reality screamed at me from the other side. The void suit was a second skin, thin, flexible material that interfaced directly with my augmentation ports, feeding sensory data into my nervous system. Pressure readings, temperature, radiation levels, structural integrity, oxygen supply, all of it flooding my brain constantly, an overwhelming deluge of information I had to learn to pass while performing delicate work in the most hostile environment imaginable. My partner for the first shift was Grevin, a man 10 years older than me, rail-thin and silent. His augmentation had gone badly. They'd damaged something during the rebreather installation, and he convulsed periodically, his body seizing as the machine forced air into damaged lungs. But he was experienced. This was his second contract. He'd survived 5 years already and signed up for another 5, whether from desperation or insanity I couldn't tell. We entered the airlock together. The outer door opened, and I saw the warp. There's no way to describe it adequately. Language is built for describing reality. Objects with fixed positions, colors that behave predictably, space that has 3 dimensions, and time that flows forward. The warp has none of those properties. It's constantly shifting, colors that don't exist, geometries that can't exist, motion that goes in directions that shouldn't exist. Looking at it directly causes pain, not metaphorical pain, but actual physical agony, as your brain tries to process sensory input that violates every assumption it's built on. The Geller field appeared as a shimmering purple barrier encasing the ship, maybe a meter thick, rippling with energy. Beyond it was the warp, and pressed against it were things. I saw faces, dozens of them, hundreds. Human faces, mostly, though wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too many eyes, mouths that opened too wide, expressions that conveyed emotions that don't exist in human psychology. They were pressed against the field like children pressing their faces against a window, peering in at us with curiosity and hunger and malice all blended together into something that made my stomach turn. "Ignore them," Grevin said through the suit's communication system. His voice was distorted, mechanical, barely recognizable as human. "They're not real. They're just projections. Psychological warfare. Focus on the work." He handed me a scraping tool, a long metal pole with a blade at the end, magnetically charged to disrupt the crystalline structure of warp barnacles. My job was simple: identify the accretions on the Geller field emitters, scrape them off without damaging the emitters or touching the field itself, and collect the residue for disposal. Simple, except I was doing it while standing on the hull of a ship traveling through hell, inches away from a barrier that was the only thing separating me from entities that wanted to consume my soul. The barnacles were growing on emitter cluster 7A, about 40 meters from the airlock. Grevin and I maglocked our way across the hull. Step, lock, release, moving carefully to avoid losing our grip. The stars were wrong. That's what I noticed. The sky around the ship wasn't black void dotted with stars. It was colors, shifting, flowing colors that hurt to perceive. Purples and greens and shades that didn't have names. And occasionally, impossibly, I saw structures in the distance. Buildings that couldn't exist, floating in emptiness. Faces the size of planets. Things that were definitely looking at us, though they were light years away or inches away. Distance didn't work here. We reached the emitter cluster. The warp barnacles were growing across the surface like tumors, organic-looking crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light. They were warm to the touch, my suit reported. 37 degrees Celsius, which made no sense because we were in hard vacuum and nothing should be generating heat. But the warp didn't care about thermodynamics. "Start scraping," Grevin said. "Shallow strokes. Don't apply too much force or you'll damage the emitter. Don't let the blade touch the field. If you break the barrier, it'll try to pull you through. If that happens, I'll cut you loose." Standing orders. We don't risk two men to save one. I positioned my scraping tool against the first barnacle and pushed. The crystalline structure resisted for a moment, then fractured, breaking apart into fragments that drifted away from the hull. The fragments didn't float like debris should. They moved with purpose, orienting themselves toward the Geller field, trying to get back to it before they dissipated into the warp. I scraped another barnacle, then another. The work was tedious and terrifying in equal measure. Every scrape risked damaging the emitter or touching the field. Every moment I was aware of the things on the other side of that shimmering purple barrier, pressed close, watching. 20 minutes into the shift, one of them made eye contact with me. I don't know how I know it made eye contact. It didn't have eyes, not really. It was a writhing mass of flesh and geometry that happened to have configurations that might have been facial features if you squinted and ignored the wrongness. But it looked at me, directly at me, and it knew I was there. The face pressed closer to the field, distorting as it pushed against the barrier. The mouth opened, too wide, unhinging like a snake's jaw, and it spoke. I couldn't hear it through the void of space, but I could read its lips. Or maybe it was pushing thoughts directly into my brain. I don't know, but I understood what it was saying. Let me in. 3 words. Simple. Polite almost. Like it was asking permission rather than demanding. Like if I just reached out and touched the field, just created a tiny crack in the barrier, it could slip through and everything would be fine. Ignore it, Grevin said. He'd noticed me staring. They all do that. They try to communicate. They try to seem reasonable. It's a trap. Keep working. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the barnacle in front of me. But I could still see it in my peripheral vision, still see the mouth moving, forming words, still feel the weight of its attention pressing against my mind like physical force. Let me in. I can help. I can show you things. I can give you power. Just open the field. Just a little. Just for a moment. Let me in. 4 hours. That's how long the shift lasted. 4 hours of scraping barnacles while things pressed against the field and whispered promises and threats. 4 hours of fighting the urge to look at them, to listen to them, to respond to them. By the end, my hands were shaking, my mind was exhausted, and I'd scraped maybe 30 square meters of hull. Grevin and I had removed perhaps 2% of the barnacles from one emitter cluster. There were 40 clusters. The infestation was growing faster than we could remove it. We returned to the airlock. The inner doors sealed behind us, and for the first time in 4 hours, I wasn't looking at the warp. The relief was overwhelming. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear off the void suit and the rebreather and breathe real air and feel human again. But I couldn't do any of those things. The rebreather was permanent. The suit was necessary for survival, and being human wasn't a luxury I could afford anymore. First shift is always the hardest, Grevin said as we cycled through decontamination. His voice was sympathetic, or as close to sympathy as a man could get when he was talking through a mechanical voice box. You'll get used to it. You'll learn to filter out the entities. You'll learn to work without thinking about what's on the other side. It becomes routine. I didn't believe him. How could anyone get used to this? How could horror become routine? But he was right. 7 years later, I understand. Horror doesn't become comfortable. It just becomes familiar. And familiar horror is still horror. You just stop reacting to it consciously. It eats away at you slowly instead of all at once, like acid instead of fire. That was shift 1. I had 2,189 more shifts ahead of me before my 5-year contract was complete. I didn't make it to the end of the contract. Week 3. I'd completed 21 shifts. My body had adapted to the augmentations. The rebreather felt almost natural now. The boot anchors no longer caused constant pain. The data ports had healed into permanent fixtures. I was becoming the tool they designed me to be. The work was exactly as Grevin had described. Routine horror. 4 hours on the hull, scraping barnacles, ignoring the entities. 8 hours off shift, sleeping in cramped quarters, eating corpse starch rations that tasted like compressed despair. 4 hours on again. The cycle repeated endlessly, shifts blurring together into an undifferentiated mass of mechanical routine punctuated by moments of absolute terror. The entities never stopped trying. Every shift they pressed against the field, forming faces, mouthing words, reaching toward us with appendages that defied geometry. They learned our patterns. They learned which hole scrapers were more susceptible to their psychological attacks. They customized their approaches, showing each of us the specific horrors that would affect us most. For me, it was my father. They formed his face in the barrier. Perfect detail, exact replication of his features down to the scar on his left cheek from a smelting accident. They moved his mouth, speaking words I couldn't hear but could read. Davos, help me. I'm trapped. Let me through. Please, I'm your father. Don't leave me here. I knew it wasn't him. Knew it was just a construct, a psychological weapon designed to create doubt and fear. But knowing didn't make it easier to ignore. Every shift I scraped barnacles while my father's face stared at me from beyond the field, begging for help I couldn't give. Month 2. We lost our first hull scraper. His name was Petran, the young man who'd asked what was on the other side during training. He was on shift with a partner named Corvin when it happened. They were scraping emitter cluster 12D when one of the entities managed to break through his mental defenses. We don't know exactly what it showed him or what it promised. But Corvin reported that Petran stopped working mid-scrape, stared at the field for perhaps 10 seconds, then reached out with his hand and touched the barrier. The field didn't break. That's what the engineers assured us later. The barrier held. But Petran's hand went through, passing into the warp, and something on the other side grabbed him. Corvin described it as hands, but not hands, more like concepts of grasping that happened to look like hands, and they pulled. Pulled Petran's hand, then his arm, then his whole body through the field while he screamed and thrashed and tried to maglock himself to the hull. It took 3 seconds for the entities to pull him completely through the barrier, void suit and all, and then he was gone. Disappeared into the warp. Corvin said he could see Petran on the other side for a moment, suspended in that impossible space, surrounded by things that were already beginning to take him apart. And then distance or dimension or something distorted, and Petran was simply gone. Not dead. Consumed. The engineers checked the field. No damage. No breach. No structural compromise. Petran had been pulled through without actually breaking the barrier, which shouldn't have been possible, but apparently was when the entities wanted someone badly enough. We continued working. What else could we do? The barnacles were still growing. The emitters still needed maintenance. The fact that we'd lost one of our crew just meant the remaining 46 had to work longer shifts to compensate. That's when I realized the Imperium's propaganda about the Emperor protecting his faithful was complete fabrication. Petran had been faithful, had prayed daily, whispered the catechisms, touched his holy icon before every shift. He believed the priests who said devotion would shield him from evil. But when the entities wanted him, prayer did nothing. The Emperor did nothing. Petran was consumed regardless of his faith, because faith is just psychological comfort that has no impact on material reality. The Emperor protects, unless you're a hull scraper on a warp-traveling merchant ship, in which case you're on your own. Month 4. The entities escalated their tactics. They'd learned that showing us faces we recognized was effective, so they refined the approach. Instead of just forming faces in the barrier, they started creating full-body simulacra, human-shaped figures pressed against the field, reaching toward us, gesturing, pantomiming distress. My father appeared again, but this time his entire body was visible. They showed him burning, flames consuming his flesh while he beat against the barrier, screaming silently for help. They showed him drowning, thrashing in non-existent water, eyes wide with terror. They showed him being torn apart, slowly, methodically, by things with too many limbs. It was torture. Exquisite, precise psychological torture designed to break our minds. And the worst part was knowing it was deliberate. The entities were intelligent. They understood human psychology well enough to craft personalized nightmares for each of us. This wasn't random malevolence. This was calculated cruelty. Some hull scrapers broke. Grevin, my original partner, started talking to the entities during shift, responding to their projections, arguing with the face of his dead brother that they showed him every day. "You're not real," he would say, over and over, like a mantra. "You're not him. He's dead. You're just wearing his face. You're not real." But repetition wore him down. By month 5, he was having conversations with the projection, asking it questions, listening to answers only he could hear. His work quality degraded. He started making mistakes, scraping too hard, damaging emitters, working slower and slower as he spent more time staring at the field than clearing barnacles. Eventually, they pulled him off hull duty and assigned him to interior maintenance. Safer work. Less contact with the entities. But by then, the damage was done. I'd see him in the corridors sometimes, talking to empty air, arguing with people who weren't there. The entities had gotten hooks into his mind, and even away from the field, they could still pull his strings. Month 6. We lost 3 more hull scrapers in 2 weeks. First was Corvin, Petran's partner. He simply didn't come back from shift one day. His partner reported that Corvin had been working normally, then stopped, stared at the field, and walked toward it, not reaching out like Patron had. Just walking, deliberately. Like he'd decided that whatever was on the other side was preferable to continuing his work. He mag-locked his way to the field, stood there for a moment, then stepped through. The field shimmered and closed behind him, and he was gone. Second was Toman, the man who'd said the Emperor protects during training. He died differently. He was scraping barnacles when his void suit developed a leak. Small one, maybe a puncture from a sharp crystalline edge. But in hard vacuum, small leaks are fatal. His suit began venting atmosphere, pressure dropping, alarm system screaming in his neural interface. His partner tried to help, but there was nothing to do. Standard procedure was to get him back to the airlock immediately, but they were 40 meters out, and it takes time to mag-lock across hull plating when you're moving carefully. Toman didn't make it. His suit pressure dropped to 0 before he reached the airlock. He died in vacuum, lungs rupturing, blood boiling, body freezing. And because we were in the warp, because the barrier between real and unreal was so thin, his soul didn't move on. It was consumed before his body finished dying. We saw it happen, saw something reach through the field just enough to grab the escaping soul and pull it back to the other side. The entities got him after all. Third was Matthias, who broke psychologically and had to be restrained. He was mid-shift when he started screaming, not through the comms, he couldn't do that, but physically screaming, the sound transmitting through his suit as vibrations. He dropped his scraping tool and started tearing at his own void suit, trying to rip it open, trying to expose himself to vacuum. His partner subdued him and dragged him back to the airlock, but even inside the ship, Matthias couldn't stop. He thrashed and fought and tried to hurt himself until they had to sedate him and lock him in medical isolation. I visited him once before they shipped him off at the next port. He was strapped to a bed, eyes wide and staring, muttering constantly. "They promised," he said when he saw me. "They promised if I let them in, they'd make it stop. Make the work stop, make the fear stop, make everything stop. They lied, they always lie, but I almost believed them. I almost touched the field, I almost let them through." They classified him as psychologically compromised and terminated his contract. No completion bonus, no compensation for the 6 months he'd served. Just dumped him on the next Imperial world and left him to survive however he could with a permanent rebreather, boot anchors, and neural trauma that would probably never heal. The Imperium's mercy. Year 1. My 1-year anniversary came and went without acknowledgement. I'd completed 365 shifts. I'd scraped approximately 14,000 square meters of hull. I'd removed tons of warp barnacles. I'd spent 1,460 hours standing on the skin of a ship while entities pressed against the field and tried to break my mind. And I'd learned something important. The propaganda. The Imperium fed us about divine protection and sacred duty was complete fiction. There was no protection, there was no divinity. There were just people doing dangerous work because the system had trapped them into it, dying or going insane at predictable rates, while the ship continued traveling and the rogue trader continued profiting and the Imperium continued not caring about any of us. The Emperor protects? No. The Emperor is a corpse who never knew I existed and wouldn't care if he did. I protect myself or I die. Those are the only options. Year 2. The entities changed their approach again. They'd exhausted the tactic of showing us dead loved ones. We'd all adapted, learned to ignore the projections, developed mental shields that made the psychological attacks less effective. So they tried something new. Beauty. Instead of horror, they showed us paradise. Fields of flowers that couldn't exist, colors more vivid than reality allowed. They showed us peace. Faces that weren't twisted or malevolent, but gentle, welcoming, promising rest. They showed us release, doorways through the field that led to places where we wouldn't have to work anymore, wouldn't have to scrape barnacles, wouldn't have to be afraid. It was almost more effective than the horror. When you're exhausted and broken and terrified, horror can be resisted through stubbornness and spite. But beauty, promise of peace, that's insidious. That makes you want to believe, want to reach out, want to accept what's offered. I came close. God, or rather, not God, because there are no gods, just tyrants and parasites wearing divine masks. But I came close to touching the field. They showed me high volantis, but clean, air that didn't burn your lungs. Sky you could see. My father alive and whole, standing in that impossible clean hive, gesturing for me to join him, promising that if I just stepped through the field, I could go home, could be free. I wanted it so badly, wanted to believe the lie. My hand moved toward the barrier, reaching out, fingers inches from the shimmering purple surface. And then I saw it. Saw the tiny flaw in the illusion, the shadow behind my father that moved wrong, that didn't match his position. The flicker in the sky that revealed the colors weren't real, were just projected images overlaying endless screaming void. The hunger underneath the beauty, barely concealed, waiting for me to touch the field so it could pull me through and consume me. I pulled my hand back, returned to scraping barnacles, ignored the paradise they offered, because it was just another trap, just another hunting tactic from predators who'd learned that honey attracts better than vinegar. But it was close. Too close. And I knew if I stayed on hull duty much longer, eventually they'd find the approach that worked, the psychological vulnerability I couldn't defend against, and I'd end up like Petran or Corvin or the dozens of others who'd been pulled through the field over the years. I needed off the hull. Year 3. I requested transfer to interior maintenance, filled out the forms, submitted them to the crew master, waited for approval. Denied. Insufficient personnel to allow transfer. You will continue current duties. I requested again. Denied again, and again, and again. They didn't care that I was breaking. Didn't care that the entities were getting better at targeting me. That I was having nightmares even during sleep shifts, that I was starting to see faces in reflective surfaces and hear whispers when the ship was quiet. They just needed bodies on the hull, and I was a body that still functioned, so I would stay on the hull until I didn't function anymore. Month 37. I made a mistake. I was scraping emitter cluster 19F. Routine work when my concentration slipped for just a moment. The entity showing me paradise had shifted tactics again. Now it was showing me my younger brother, Kellum, who I'd barely thought about in years. He was standing in the illusory clean hive, smiling, waving at me. And in that moment of distraction, I scraped too hard. The blade bit into the emitter casing, gouging through the protective layer, exposing the mechanisms underneath. Sparks flashed in vacuum, somehow impossibly because there was no oxygen to burn, and the emitter began to fluctuate. The Geller field dimmed, pulsed, wavered. For 3 seconds, 3 eternal seconds, the barrier between real and unreal thinned to almost nothing. I could see through the field to the other side, could see the entities in their true forms, not the projected faces and bodies, but the actual things they were. Vast, incomprehensible, made of malice and hunger and geometries that made my brain scream in protest at perceiving them. And they could see me, really see me, not just my physical form, but everything underneath, my thoughts, my fears, my memories, my soul, laid bare and exposed and vulnerable. One of them reached toward me. Not through the field, it was still holding, barely, but toward me. And I felt something fundamental shift in my consciousness. Felt hooks sink into my mind, connections establishing, a presence inserting itself into the spaces between my thoughts. It whispered, "I know you now, Davos Crane. I know every corner of your mind, and when the field fails, when, not if, I will be waiting. You belong to me." The emitter stabilized. The field solidified. The entity withdrew, but I could still feel it. Feel its presence lurking at the edges of my consciousness, waiting, patient, certain. I'd been marked. I returned to the airlock and reported the damaged emitter. They assigned a repair crew, docked my pay for the mistake, and sent me back out for my next shift. No concern for the fact that I'd almost been pulled through the field. No recognition that something had changed, that I was compromised. Just functional assessment. Scraper still operational. Continue using. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't survive my 5-year contract. The entities had their hooks in me. They knew me. And eventually, inevitably, they'd find the right moment to pull me through. I was already dead. I just hadn't stopped moving yet. Year 4. The presence in my mind grew stronger. It wasn't constant. Mostly it lurked in the background, a weight I'd learned to carry. But during shifts, when I was on the hull scraping barnacles, it would surface, would whisper suggestions, would show me images directly in my mind, bypassing my eyes entirely, would try to convince me to touch the field. "Just reach out," it would say, in a voice that sounded almost like my father's, but wrong, distorted. "Just touch it. I'll make everything stop. The work, the fear, the exhaustion. You'll never have to scrape another barnacle. You'll be free." I resisted. Kept working. Focused on the mechanical repetition of scrape, collect, dispose, repeat. Focused on anything except the voice in my head that promised relief if I would just give in. But resistance was exhausting. Every shift required more effort to maintain mental discipline. Every day, the voice got slightly more convincing. Every week I felt my defenses eroding a little more. Other hull scrapers noticed. My partner, a man named Silas, who'd been on the crew for 6 years, started keeping closer watch on me during shifts, positioning himself between me and the field whenever possible, ready to grab me if I made any move toward the barrier. "You're compromised," he said during one shift, his mechanical voice flat and certain. "I've seen it happen before. Entity got hooks into you. You'll fight it for a while, but eventually you'll lose. They always win eventually." "How long?" I asked. "Depends on the person. Some last months, some last years. Longest I saw was a hull scraper named Doran who held out for 7 years after being marked, but he lost eventually. Walked into the field mid-shift, didn't fight, didn't hesitate. Just walked through like he'd finally accepted what was waiting for him. 7 years. Doran had lasted 7 years fighting the presence in his mind. I'd been fighting for 8 months. Could I hold out another 6+ years? No, I knew I couldn't. My mental defenses were already crumbling. I was seeing things that weren't there, hearing whispers during sleep shifts, experiencing dissociative episodes where I'd lose time and come back to awareness without knowing where I'd been or what I'd done. The entity was consuming me slowly, progressively, breaking me down until there wouldn't be enough of Davos Crane left to resist anymore. Month 51. I tried to kill myself. It happened during a sleep shift. I'd been lying in my bunk trying to rest, but the voice wouldn't stop. It was showing me images. Paradise again, but personalized, specific to my desires. A life away from the merchant's reprieve. A life where I wasn't a hull scraper. A life where I could breathe real air and speak with my own voice and exist as a human being instead of a specialized tool. And all I had to do was touch the field. Just touch it. Just once. Just let the entity through. I couldn't take it anymore. The psychological pressure was unbearable, but I knew if I touched the field I wouldn't just die. My soul would be consumed, would exist in eternal torment in the warp, would suffer in ways that made physical death look like mercy. So I tried a different approach. I took a maintenance tool, a simple razor blade used for precision cutting, and opened the arteries in my wrists. Both of them, deep cuts, blood flowing. The rebreather wouldn't help with blood loss. I'd simply bleed out, die, and my soul would go wherever souls go. Oblivion, maybe. Better than the alternative. I lay back and waited to die, but the crew found me. Someone noticed the blood seeping under my bunk's door, investigated, called medical. They stabilized me, transfused my blood, repaired the arterial damage, and put me back together. The ship's medical officer was annoyed, not concerned. "Suicide attempts violate your contract," he said while servitors sutured my wrists. "You'll be docked pay for the medical resources expended. Further attempts will result in behavioral modification protocols. You will continue working until your contract expires or you die naturally. Those are your options." No compassion, no recognition that I was breaking under the psychological strain. Just pragmatic resource management. I was an asset that had tried to damage itself, and the system would take measures to prevent further loss of value. They put me back on duty the next day, wrists bandaged, mind still fragmenting, presence in my head laughing at my failed attempt to escape. "You can't die," it whispered. "Not without me. I'm part of you now. The only way to be free is to come through the field. Let me in completely. Stop fighting. Accept what you are. Accept what you'll become." Year 5. My contract was supposed to end. 5 years of service. Completion bonus? Freedom. That's what they'd promised when I signed. But we were mid-warp transit when the date arrived. Ships don't drop back to real space just because a crew member's contract expired. We'd be in the warp for another 4 months before reaching the next port. 4 more months of scraping barnacles. 4 more months of fighting the entity in my head. 4 more months of deteriorating mental stability. I didn't think I could last 4 more months. Month 62. We lost 11 hull scrapers in 1 day. It happened during a warp storm, a phenomenon where the immaterium becomes more turbulent, more aggressive, pressing harder against the Geller field. The emitters were being overwhelmed, barnacles growing faster than we could remove them, field strength dropping to dangerous levels. They sent all remaining hull scrapers out simultaneously, all 31 of us who were still functional, to clear as many emitters as possible before the field failed entirely. The entities were frenzied, pressed against the barrier so thick they obscured vision, faces and limbs and impossible geometries piled on each other in their hunger to break through. The psychological attacks intensified proportionally. Every hull scraper was being shown their personalized nightmare simultaneously, overwhelmed with images and voices and promises and threats. 11 broke. 11 men simultaneously decided that whatever was on the other side of the field was preferable to continuing their work, and they touched the barrier, all at once, like they'd coordinated, like the entities had synchronized their final psychological pushes for maximum effect. I watched them go through, watched them pulled into the warp, bodies distorting as they passed through the barrier, suits tearing apart, flesh unraveling into components that didn't resemble human anatomy. Watched the entities descend on them like predators on wounded prey. Heard their screams, somehow heard them, even in vacuum, even through the field, as the things began consuming them. And the entity in my head said, "That could be you, should be you, will be you. Why fight? Why resist? Everyone breaks eventually. Everyone comes through. You're already mine, Davos. You've been mine since I marked you. Stop struggling. Accept it." I wanted to. God, or whatever passes for God in this nightmare universe. I wanted to stop fighting. Wanted to give in. Wanted to believe the promise that surrender would end the suffering. But I didn't. I scraped barnacles while my crewmates were consumed around me. Scraped and scraped and scraped, mechanical and unthinking, because if I stopped to consider what I was doing, I'd break too. Month 63. We dropped back to real space at Hesperos Station. The warp transit was over. The hull scrapers who'd survived, 20 of the original 47, plus some recruits they'd picked up at other ports, were allowed shore leave while the ship underwent refit. I stood on the station's observation deck, looking out at the stars. Real stars. Fixed positions. Predictable light. No faces. No entities. No voices in my head. The presence had gone dormant the moment we left the warp, retreating to wherever it existed when we weren't in its domain. I could leave. My contract was complete, technically over-complete since I'd worked 63 months instead of the 60 stipulated. I was owed my completion bonus. I could collect it, disembark, never set foot on the merchant's reprieve again. But I didn't have anywhere to go. The augmentations marked me as a hull scraper. No respectable work would hire someone with a permanent rebreather and data ports studding their body. I could return to High Volantis, but what would I do there? I couldn't work the smelting furnaces anymore. Couldn't do any job that required normal breathing. The Imperium had modified me into a specialized tool, and that tool only had value in one context: scraping barnacles off Geller field emitters during warp transit. And I needed the money. 5 years of work should have earned me 100,000 throne gelt, enough to set myself up independently. But the constant pay docs, for medical resources, for damaged equipment, for reduced work efficiency, had cut that down to maybe 30,000. Not enough to retire, barely enough to survive a few years. So when they offered me a renewal contract, another 5 years, same terms, same work, I signed it. Not because I wanted to. Not because I thought I could survive another 5 years, but because I didn't have any other options. The system had trapped me perfectly, modified me into a tool that only had value doing one specific job, then made that job so psychologically destructive that it guaranteed I'd never last long enough to accumulate real wealth. Perfect efficiency. Perfect cruelty. I signed. Pressed my thumb to the data slate. Committed myself to another 5 years of horror. The recruiting officer smiled. "The Emperor protects the faithful servant," he said. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond, with my voice taken and my rebreather making speech impossible. But I thought, the Emperor is a corpse, and faith is a lie, and the only thing protecting anyone is luck and the thickness of the Geller field. Month 64. We transitioned back into the warp. New route, new destination, same work. The entity in my head woke up immediately, resuming its whisper campaign like no time had passed. "Welcome back, Davos. I missed you. Did you think you could escape? Did you think leaving the warp would free you? I'm part of you now. I exist in the spaces between your thoughts. You can't leave me behind. You can never leave me behind. I suited up, entered the airlock, stepped onto the hull. Mag-locked my way to the emitter clusters that were already growing barnacles, because they always grow barnacles, because the entities never stop pressing against the field, never stop trying to break through. I picked up my scraping tool. I began to work. And the entity whispered, 4 more years, Davos. Can you last 4 more years? I don't think you can. I don't think you'll last 4 more months. Your mind is fragmenting. Your defenses are failing. Soon, very soon, you'll be mine. It was probably right. I probably wouldn't last 4 more years. Probably wouldn't even last 1. But I'd work until I couldn't work anymore, because that's what the system demanded. I'd scrape barnacles until I broke or died or was pulled through the field, because I'd signed the contract and the Imperium enforced its contracts absolutely. Year 6, month 70. I stopped being able to tell the difference between shifts and sleep time. Everything blurred into continuous work, continuous fear, continuous presence in my head. I'd lose hours, sometimes days, coming back to awareness while scraping barnacles without any memory of how I got there or how long I'd been working. The other hull scrapers avoided me. They recognized the signs. I was marked, compromised, close to breaking. Being near me was dangerous. When someone was about to go through the field, they sometimes tried to take others with them. Grab an arm, pull them along, share the consumption. Better not to get close. Silas, my long-term partner, requested a different work assignment. Got transferred to cargo handling. Safer work, away from the hull, away from me. I didn't blame him. I'd do the same if I could. They paired me with new recruits after that. Young men on their first contracts, not yet experienced enough to recognize how close I was to the edge. They'd last a few shifts, noticed the way I stared at the field too long, noticed the way I sometimes talked to myself, to the entity, really, arguing with it, bargaining with it, begging it to leave me alone. And then they'd request different partners. Eventually, they stopped assigning me partners at all. Just sent me out solo, 4-hour shifts, scraping barnacles alone while the entities pressed close and the voice in my head never, ever stopped. Give in, it said, over and over, constant and patient. Give in, let me through, end the struggle, end the pain. You're so tired, Davos, so broken. Let me give you peace. Let me take you apart. Let me consume you. It won't hurt. It'll feel like relief, like finally putting down a burden you've carried too long. Just reach out, just touch the field, just once. Month 73. I touched the field. Not deliberately. Or maybe it was deliberate. I'm still not certain. I was scraping barnacles on emitter cluster 4K routine work when my hand slipped. The scraping tool skittered across the hull plating, and I overcompensated, reaching out to steady myself. My hand made contact with the shimmering purple barrier. For an instant, less than a second, my fingers were through the field, reaching into the warp itself. I felt the entities on the other side, felt them grasping for me, felt the hunger and malice and eagerness as they recognized I'd finally made contact. Felt hooks sinking into my arm, pulling, trying to drag me through. I jerked back, pulled my hand away. The field sealed behind me, intact, undamaged. But the damage was done. Not to the field, to me. The entity in my head surged, triumphant, no longer just a voice, but a presence, solid and real, occupying space in my consciousness that I couldn't reclaim. Yes, it said, and its voice was louder than my own thoughts. Finally you touched it. You let me in. You gave permission. Now I'm not just watching, I'm here. In you, with you, part of you. We're merging, Davos, becoming one. And when we're finished, you won't be you anymore. You'll be we. You'll be us. You'll be me. I felt it then. Felt my consciousness fragmenting, pieces of my identity being consumed and replaced with otherness, memories dissolving, thoughts being overwritten, the fundamental sense of self, the thing that made me Davos Crane, eroding like metal under acid. I tried to fight it, tried to hold on to who I was, but I was so tired, so exhausted from years of fighting, years of scraping barnacles, years of standing on the hall while horror pressed against the field. I didn't have the strength left to resist. Month 74. I could no longer remember my father's face. I knew I'd had a father, knew his name had been something, knew he'd died in a smelting furnace. But I couldn't reconstruct his features, couldn't remember the sound of his voice, or the texture of his work-scarred hands, or any of the specific memories that had once defined my relationship with him. The entity was eating my past, consuming the memories that made me human, replacing them with its own alien thoughts and perspectives. Month 75. I stopped thinking of myself as I, and started thinking of myself as we. The entity wasn't separate anymore. It was integrated, woven into my consciousness so thoroughly that I couldn't distinguish its thoughts from mine. When I looked at the warp, I saw it differently, not as horror, but as home, as potential, as something beautiful in its malevolence. Month 76. I started bringing other hull scrapers with me. Not deliberately. Or maybe it was deliberate. The boundaries were too blurred to tell. But when I was on shift, I'd talk to the new recruits, or rather, the entity would talk through me, using my mechanical voice, my damaged vocal cords. It would show them the paradise projections, would promise them peace and freedom and relief, would whisper exactly the right psychological triggers to make them lower their defenses. 3 recruits went through the field in month 76. I was there when all 3 touched the barrier. I watched them pull through, watched them consumed. And part of me, the part that was still Davos, screamed in horror at what I was doing, but the part that was the entity felt satisfaction, felt pleasure, felt the joy of feeding, of consuming, of expanding its influence. I was becoming the thing I'd fought for 6 years, was becoming a tool the entities used to compromise other hull scrapers, to create more openings in human mental defenses, to increase their harvest. Month 77. The crew realized what I'd become. They pulled me off active duty, locked me in isolation, designated me as psychologically compromised and potentially dangerous. The captain wanted to space me, just open the airlock and jettison me into the void. But the crew master argued that I was still valuable, still had 4 years left on my contract, still represented an investment of resources and training. So they kept me, locked in a bare metal cell, 3 meters by 3 meters, with nothing but a sleep shelf and a waste disposal unit. No stimulation, no contact, just isolation, hoping that removing me from the warp's direct influence would allow me to recover. It didn't work. The entity was too deeply integrated. It existed in my consciousness now, permanent and ineradicable. And even isolated from the physical warp, I could still sense it. Could still feel the vast, hungry presence pressing against reality, waiting for the barriers to thin, waiting for opportunities to feed. Month 80. We dropped back to real space for refitting. The entity went dormant again, retreating into the background of my consciousness. For the first time in months, I could think clearly, could recognize what I'd become, could understand that I was no longer entirely human, that I'd been compromised so thoroughly that recovery was impossible. I asked to be terminated, formally requested that they end my contract and my life because I was too dangerous to keep alive. I'd become a vector for warp entities, a bridge they could use to influence other humans. Keeping me alive risked the entire crew. Request denied. You have 3 years and 4 months remaining on your contract. You will serve that time. Afterward, we'll evaluate your psychological status and determine appropriate disposition. Translation. They'd keep using me until my contract expired, then probably space me anyway. Or turn me into a servitor, consciousness trapped in a body that followed commands without thought. Either way, I'd continue suffering. Month 81. We transitioned back into the warp. The entity surged, fully active again, overwhelming my consciousness. I was barely present anymore, just a passenger in my own body, watching the entity puppet my meat while it whispered to crew members through the walls, projected thoughts into their minds during sleep shifts, slowly compromised more and more of the hull scrapers. The crew master finally recognized I was too dangerous to keep aboard. They sedated me, locked me in a stasis pod, and kept me frozen for the duration of the warp transit. Unconscious. Inactive. No longer a threat. But even in stasis, I could feel the entity. Could feel it existing in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and unconsciousness. Could feel it feeding on my dreams, corrupting my subconscious, ensuring that when they eventually woke me, I'd be even less human than before. Year 7. They woke me at Hesperos Station again. Pulled me out of stasis, evaluated my psychological state, determined I was still compromised but potentially salvageable. Put me in therapy. Crude, brutal therapy that involved psychoactive drugs and pain conditioning and endless repetition of imperial catechisms meant to reinforce proper thought patterns. It didn't work. You can't therapy away a warp entity that's merged with your consciousness. You can't drug it into submission or condition it out of existence. It's too fundamental, too integrated. I was permanently changed, permanently tainted. But they tried anyway because I represented an investment, and the Imperium doesn't write off investments without exhausting every option. Month 86. They declared me partially rehabilitated and put me back on hull duty. Not as a scraper anymore. They recognized I was too compromised for direct field contact. But as a supervisor. My job was to oversee the new hull scrapers, watch them work, report any signs of psychological compromise. The irony was suffocating. I was compromised beyond recovery, and they tasked me with identifying compromise in others. But I did the work. Or rather, the entity did the work through me. It watched the hull scrapers, identified the vulnerable ones, whispered to them through my mechanical voice, slowly created more openings for further infiltration. And I watched it happen from inside my own head, screaming silently, unable to stop it, unable to warn anyone, unable to do anything except continue existing as the entity's tool. Year 7. Month 90. The captain finally made the decision to space me. I'd been too successful at compromising the new recruits. 12 of them had gone through the field in 6 months, far higher than the normal attrition rate. The crew recognized I was the common factor, that I was somehow facilitating the losses. They took me to the airlock without ceremony. No trial, no formal termination, just pragmatic resource management. I'd become more liability than asset, so I was being disposed of. I stood in the airlock, magnetic boots locked to the deck, while the captain explained through the intercom, "You violated your contract by compromising ship security. Therefore, we are exercising our right to terminate your employment with extreme prejudice. Your pay will be transferred to your designated account, minus costs for damages caused. May the Emperor have mercy on your soul." The Emperor. That corpse on a throne 10,000 light-years away, who'd never known I existed, who couldn't have mercy even if he wanted to because he was barely alive himself. The propaganda promised his protection, his mercy, his grace, but I'd learned the truth. There is no protection, there is no mercy. There is only the system, grinding people into components, consuming them without thought or care. The airlock's outer door opened. Vacuum pulled at me, but my mag boots held. They'd have to deactivate them manually, release me to be sucked into the void. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want to die. Even compromised, Even consumed by the entity, even barely human anymore. I wanted to exist, wanted to continue no matter how horrible that continuation would be. "Don't do this," I tried to say. But my voice was gone, replaced by mechanical wheezing. "Please, I'll do better. I'll fight it. They deactivated my boots. Vacuum took me, pulled me through the airlock into empty space, and the entity said, "Finally, now we go home. Now we return to the warp. Now you see what you truly are, what you've become, what we are together." The ship was still in warp space. The Geller field was active, maintaining a bubble of reality around the vessel. But I was outside that bubble now, floating in the immaterium itself. No suit, no protection. Just my augmented body, exposed to the impossible nightmare of the warp. I should have died instantly, should have been torn apart, consumed, destroyed. But I didn't die. The entity in my consciousness anchored me, gave me form and continuity even in that formless place. I existed in the warp, not as a human, but as something else. Something changed. Something that had merged human consciousness with warp entity and become a hybrid that could survive in both realms. I floated there, watching the merchant's reprieve pull away, Geller field shimmering around it. I could see the hull scrapers on the surface, tiny figures mag-locked to the metal, scraping barnacles. I could see the faces pressed against the field, my fellow entities, my kin, the things I'd become part of. And I understood. This was eternal. I wouldn't die, wouldn't fade. I existed now in the warp, consciousness preserved by the entity I'd merged with, trapped forever in this nightmare dimension. I'd escaped my contract, escaped the ship, escaped the work, but the price was becoming exactly what I'd fought against for 7 years. I was one of them now. One of the faces pressed against the Geller field. One of the entities that whispered to hull scrapers, that showed them paradise, that tried to pull them through. I'd become a tool for the warp itself, forever used to compromise others, forever existing in hunger and malice and desperate feeding. The propaganda promised the Emperor protects. But where was his protection? Where was the divinity that supposedly shielded humanity from evil? Nowhere. Because there was no divinity. No protection. Only systems that consumed people, entities that fed on souls, and an imperium that ground its citizens into components while calling the process holy. How long have I been here? Time doesn't work in the warp. Could be months. Could be millennia. I've watched ships pass. Dozens of them, hundreds, each one wrapped in its shimmering Geller field, each one carrying hull scrapers who scrape barnacles while we press against the barrier and whisper our promises. I recognize the pattern now. Recognize the cycle. Young men recruited with promises of wealth, modified past the point of return, trapped into work that destroys them physically and psychologically, broken and consumed, replaced with fresh recruits. The system perpetuates eternally, grinding through human lives, while the rogue traders profit and the Imperium claims it's all for humanity's benefit. I press against the field when ships pass. Form faces. Human faces. Familiar faces. The faces that will most disturb whoever is on the other side. I mouth words. "Let me in. I can help. I can show you things. Just open the field. Just a little." And sometimes they listen. Sometimes they reach out. Sometimes they touch the barrier, and I pull them through and they join us. Join me. Join the eternal hunger and malice and desperate existence that is the warp. I see the merchant's reprieve occasionally. It still travels the same routes, still carries hull scrapers, still maintains its Geller field through constant work. I recognize some of the scrapers. New recruits who signed contracts just like I did, who believed the promises just like I did, who'll be broken and consumed just like I was. I want to warn them. Want to tell them to run, to refuse, to die fighting rather than sign contracts with the Imperium's merchant vessels. but I can't communicate anything except the whispers the warp demands I speak. I'm a tool now, a component in the system, used to perpetuate the very horror I suffered. 47 of us signed contracts that day on High Volantis. I've seen 39 of them in the warp since then. Dead, consumed, transformed into entities like me, pressed against the fields, whispering to new recruits. Grevin is here. Petran is here. Corvin. Toman. Matthias. All of us who touched the field, who were pulled through, who died but didn't die. All of us trapped eternal, consciousness preserved in horror, forever existing in hunger we can't satisfy. The remaining 8? I don't know. Maybe they survived their contracts. Maybe they escaped. Maybe they're still scraping barnacles somewhere, fighting the entities, resisting the whispers. Or maybe they're dead in some other way, souls consumed but bodies destroyed, not trapped here with the rest of us. I hope they escaped. I hope someone escaped. Because if everyone ends up here, if this is the inevitable fate of every hull scraper, then the system is perfect in its cruelty. Perfect in its efficiency, perfect in its ability to consume people completely and eternally. The Emperor protects, the propaganda claims. But I'm living proof that he doesn't, that he never did. That faith is just psychological conditioning designed to make people compliant, and prayers are just empty words that change nothing. I'm in the warp. I've been here forever. I'll be here forever. I'm no longer human, but I remember being human. Remember scraping barnacles. Remember standing on the hull of the Merchant's Reprieve while reality pressed against the field. Remember my father, just barely. The last fragments of memory that the entity hasn't fully consumed yet. My name was Davos Kran. I was 22 years old when I signed the contract. I'm something else now. Something that exists in eternal hunger, eternal malice, eternal suffering. Something that presses against Geller fields and whispers to hull scrapers and pulls them through when they're weak enough to listen. I am what happens when the Imperium's systems consume someone completely. When faith fails. When protection never materializes. When propaganda meets reality and reality wins absolutely. I am eternal. I am aware. I am suffering. And there's a ship approaching now. Geller field active. Hull scrapers on the surface, scraping barnacles. Young men, desperate men. Men who signed contracts believing promises of wealth and future. I press against the field. Form a face. Young, human, familiar. I mouth words, help me. I'm trapped, let me through, please. And maybe one of them will listen. Maybe one of them will reach out. Maybe one of them will touch the field and join us here, eternal, forever hungry, forever feeding. The system perpetuates. The ships keep traveling. The hull scrapers keep scraping. The entities keep pressing. Nothing changes. Nothing improves. Just eternal cycle of consumption and suffering, forever and ever and ever. The Emperor protects nothing. The warp consumes everything. And I am the space between, trapped, eternal, whispering to the next victim, perpetuating the horror I suffered, unable to stop, unable to warn, unable to do anything except exist and hunger and press against the field. My name was Davos Crane. Now I'm just another face in the purple barrier. Just another voice whispering lies. Just another entity in the warp. Forever.